The wind didn't just whisper across the plains that night. It screamed. It clawed at the sun-scorched earth, kicking up dust that tasted of endings. The Texas frontier was a brutal place, a land that didn't care about your dreams. It only cared if you were strong enough to wake up the next morning. And in this land of monsters and men, one man's name was spoken with a mix of fear and awe. They called him the Hunter Hercules, Chauncey Branrary. He rode alone, a ghost against the dying sun, a man who knew the land's secrets. He'd learned its language, the subtle shift in the air before a storm, the silence before a kill. And tonight, the land was telling him something was wrong. Then he heard it. Not the wind this time, a human scream, sharp, ragged, and terrified. A woman. His horse stopped before he even gave the command, its ears twitching. Chauncey's hand, scarred and steady, went to the rifle on his saddle. He wasn't a hero. He was a survivor. But in the wild, sometimes those were the same thing. He urged his horse forward, his eyes scanning the dark ridgeline. And then he saw her. She was a flicker of motion in the tall, dead grass, running like her soul was on fire. Her steps were clumsy, desperate. Behind her, the darkness moved. Two yellow eyes, burning like hot coals, floated in the night. A shadow, sleek and black, slunk low to the ground. A panther. But it was bigger than any panther he'd ever seen. Its shoulders were thick with muscle, its movements too deliberate, too intelligent. It wasn't just hunting for food. It was hunting for sport. The beast let out a low, rumbling growl, a sound that vibrated deep in Chauncey's bones. It coiled its body, a black spring of muscle and claw ready to unleash hell. The woman stumbled, falling to her knees. It was over. A flash of black fur, a glint of razor-sharp claws in the moonlight. The world exploded in a crack of gunpowder and fire. Then, silence. A heavy, ringing silence that swallowed the prairie whole. Donna froze, her breath caught in her throat. 1 second, death was lunging for her neck. The next, the world had gone silent. A heavy thud broke the stillness. The massive panther crashed to the ground, its own momentum carrying it in a lifeless skid. It slid through the dry grass, kicking up a cloud of dust before coming to a stop just inches from her feet. It was a monster. Its sleek black fur was matted with dirt, its yellow eyes now dull and lifeless, staring into nothing. The fire was gone. The air smelled of gunpowder and fear. Donna's gaze shifted from the dead beast to the silhouette on horseback, the man who had fired the shot. He lowered his rifle, the movement slow and deliberate. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The dead panther said it all. She scrambled to her feet, her whole body trembling as she ran to him, gripping his arm like he was the only solid thing in a world that had just tried to tear her apart. "I shouldn't have survived," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I just ran." Chauncey looked down at her, his face a mask carved from shadow and moonlight. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, his voice, low and steady, cut through the night. "You ran because you weren't ready to die." She looked up at him, her wide green eyes searching his face. He saw the terror there, but underneath it, something else. A flicker of steel. A spark that hadn't been extinguished. Her name was Donna Iola. Her family had come to Texas chasing a dream, a patch of land to call their own. But the frontier chewed up dreams and spit them out as nightmares. The raid had come without warning. Not Comanche, she'd said. Something else. Men with painted faces, but their eyes were wrong. Their war cries felt hollow, practiced. They'd burned everything, taken everything. Her father had screamed at her to run, to take the small leather pouch at her belt, and never look back. She hadn't. She had just run. The memory was a fresh, bleeding wound in her soul. Chauncey's gaze drifted past her to the dark ridgeline. The autumn chill was in the air, a promise of the harshness to come. Whoever they were, they wouldn't give up easily. Are they still coming?" she asked, her grip on his coat tightening. He didn't answer right away. He just looked out into the darkness, his senses on high alert. He had survived this long by trusting his gut, and right now, his gut was screaming. He finally looked back at her, his eyes piercing. "You're still breathing," he said. "That means you're worth chasing." But as he helped her onto his horse, his eyes fell back to the dead panther. Something was wrong. He slid from his saddle and knelt beside the beast. Its size was unnatural, but that wasn't it. Around its thick neck was a strip of braided leather, and tied to it was a small piece of carved bone, marked with a strange, unfamiliar symbol. This wasn't a wild animal. It was a dog of war. Someone had trained it, sent it after her, and that changed everything. This wasn't a random attack. It was a hunt, and Donna was the fox. Chauncey stood, holding the strange bone talisman. The carving was precise, a symbol he'd never seen before. It wasn't Comanche. It wasn't Apache. It was something else. "What is it?" Donna asked from atop the horse, her voice trembling. "Trouble," Chauncey said, his jaw tight. He tucked the talisman into his pocket. It was a clue, and he had a feeling he'd need it. "The men who attacked your homestead, they weren't natives." Donna's eyes widened. "But their faces... the paint..." "A disguise," Chauncey cut in. "A common trick. They burn a homestead, leave a few arrows behind, and the blame falls on the Comanche. It lets them operate in the shadows." He looked up at her. "This is worse, Donna. A Comanche raid is about territory or revenge. This is a targeted operation. And they sent that thing after you to finish the job quietly." A new wave of terror washed over her. It was one thing to be the victim of a random, brutal act. It was another to be the specific target of a hidden enemy. She instinctively clutched the small leather pouch at her waist, the one her father had told her to protect. She didn't even know what was inside, only that it was worth more than their lives. Suddenly, a sound cut through the wind. Distant at first, then closer, the rhythmic thunder of hoofbeats. And they were coming fast. Chauncey vaulted into the saddle behind her without a word. "Hold on," he growled, and the words were barely out of his mouth before he kicked the horse into a full gallop. The prairie became a blur of dead grass and moonlight. The hoofbeats behind them grew louder, a relentless drumbeat of doom. War cries split the night. But Chauncey was right. They sounded hollow, forced, an imitation. He risked a glance over his shoulder. Shadows on horseback, at least half a dozen of them, spread out in a wide formation. They weren't just chasing, they were flanking, closing a net around them. And they were good, too good. Donna clung to him, the wind whipping her hair across her face. "They're gaining on us!" "I know," he gritted out. Then, one of the riders broke from the pack, a dark shape against the horizon. He rode with an unnerving confidence, his silhouette unmistakable. He was pushing them, guiding them, steering them toward a predetermined spot on this vast, empty map. Chauncey felt a cold dread creep up his spine. He knew that style of riding. The way the man sat in the saddle, the way he seemed to be one with his horse. It couldn't be. The lead rider raised a hand, not with a weapon, but a signal. The others held back. He was toying with them. Then the man's voice, amplified by the open prairie, rolled toward them. A voice from a grave Chauncey himself had dug years ago. "Run all you want, Chauncey! You can't escape what you are!" The name hit him like a physical blow. Jedediah Kane, his old partner from the Rangers, a man he'd watched fall, a man he had left for dead in the ruins of a burning mission in Mexico. And he was alive. Jedediah Kane. The name was a ghost, a curse Chauncey thought he had buried deep in the past, but the past had a way of crawling out of its grave on the frontier. And now it was hunting him. "Who is he?" Donna yelled over the thunder of their horses' hooves. Chauncey's face was grim. "A demon I thought was dead." The chase was no longer a frantic escape. It was a personal vendetta played out across the Texas plains. Jedediah wasn't just trying to catch them, he was enjoying it. He was reminding Chauncey that no matter how far he ran, he couldn't outrun the man he used to be. Arrows sliced through the air, not aimed to kill but to steer. One landed just ahead of their horse, another to the right. Jedediah was an artist, and the prairie was his canvas. He was painting them into a corner. Chauncey knew he couldn't win a straight race. Their horse was strong, but it was carrying two, and Jedediah's men were fresh. He needed to change the game, to break the pattern. His eyes scanned the landscape, desperate for an advantage, and then he saw it. A dark line in the earth ahead, a dry riverbed, a canyon. It was a suicidal gamble. The banks were steep, riddled with loose rock. A single misstep and their horse would break a leg, throwing them to the wolves below. But staying in the open was a death sentence on the installment plan. Jedediah wanted him to run. He wanted him to feel powerless. Chauncey wasn't about to give him the satisfaction. "Hold on tight!" he yelled to Donna. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command. He yanked hard on the reins, turning the horse sharply toward the cliff edge. For a split second, the horse resisted, sensing the danger. But Chauncey was its master. He spurred it on, and with a desperate neigh, the animal leaped into the abyss. The world tilted. They were falling more than riding. Loose rock and dirt cascaded around them in a mini avalanche. Donna let out a sharp cry, burying her face in Chauncey's back. The horse's hooves scrambled for purchase, finding none. For a sickening moment, Chauncey thought he'd made a fatal mistake. Then they hit the bottom. The impact was brutal, a bone-jarring slam that sent a shockwave through his entire body. The horse stumbled, its legs buckling, but somehow, miraculously, it stayed upright. They were alive. They were at the bottom of the canyon. Above them, on the rim, the silhouettes of Jedediah's men appeared. They had stopped, surprised by his reckless move. But as Chauncey looked at the triumphant figure of Jedediah Kane, he saw him smile. A slow, cruel smile that chilled him to the bone. He hadn't forced them into a trap. He had simply guided them home. The canyon floor was eerily silent. The high, jagged walls blocked out the moonlight, plunging them into a deep, oppressive darkness. The air was cold, still. Too still. "Did we lose them?" Donna whispered, her voice barely audible. "No," Chauncey said, his voice low and grim. "We're exactly where he wants us." He swung down from the horse and helped her down. His body ached from the landing, but his mind was racing. Jedediah was a master strategist. Every move was calculated. This canyon was the final square on the chessboard. They had to find cover. Now. He led the horse deeper into the winding gorge, its hooves making soft crunching sounds on the gravelly floor. The canyon walls were a maze of shadows and strange rock formations. It would be easy to get lost, but it was also easy to hide. After a few minutes of tense walking, he spotted it. A dark opening in the rock face, partially hidden by a curtain of ancient, withered vines. A cave. "In here," he ordered, pulling the horse into the narrow entrance. The air inside was stale and cold. It smelled of damp earth and something else. Something metallic. Like old blood. He pulled a small tinderbox from his saddlebag and struck a match. The tiny flame flickered to life, casting dancing shadows on the cave walls. And what he saw made his blood run cold. This wasn't just a cave. It was a supply depot. Crates were stacked against the far wall. Barrels of water, sacks of grain, and racks of weapons, rifles, pistols, boxes of ammunition, and on the side of one of the larger crates, a brand was burned into the wood. A familiar symbol. Donna gasped. She pointed a trembling finger at the crate. "That brand," she said, her voice a choked whisper. "It was on my father's wagon. He said it was for a new business partner." The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in Chauncey's mind. Her father wasn't just a simple homesteader. He was tangled up with Jedediah Kane. The raid wasn't about stealing supplies or land. It was about tying up a loose end. Donna seemed to come to the same conclusion. Her hand went to the leather pouch at her belt. With shaking fingers, she fumbled with the clasp and pulled it open. It didn't contain gold or jewels. Inside was a small, worn book, a ledger. She opened it. The pages were filled with her father's neat handwriting, dates, names, locations, and columns of figures. It was a record of every dirty deal, every shipment of stolen goods, every crime Jedediah Kane's operation had committed. This was why they were being hunted. This little book was enough to bring Kane's entire empire crashing down. It was the ultimate leverage, and they were holding it right in the heart of his stronghold. A shadow fell across the mouth of the cave. A calm, mocking voice drifted in from the darkness. "Took you long enough to figure it out. Now be a good lad and hand over my property." One of Kane's men stood there, silhouetted against the night sky, and he was holding Chauncey's rifle. The outlaw grinned, the firelight from their match glinting off his yellow teeth. He had them, trapped, unarmed, and exposed. But he had made two mistakes. First, he assumed Chauncey's only weapon was his rifle. Second, he assumed Donna was just a frightened girl. Chauncey didn't hesitate. He kicked a loose rock on the cave floor, sending it skittering into the darkness. The outlaw's eyes flickered toward the sound for a fraction of a second. It was all the time Chauncey needed. He moved like a blur, a predator uncoiling. In his hand was the long-bladed knife he always kept sheathed at his belt. The outlaw tried to bring the rifle around, but Chauncey was already on him. The fight was short, brutal, and silent. A muffled grunt, the sickening thud of a body hitting the cave floor, and it was over. Chauncey stood over the fallen man, his chest heaving. He retrieved his rifle, his movements economical and precise. Donna stood frozen, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and awe. She had seen men fight before, but this was different. This was the cold, efficient lethality that had earned him his name. "We have to go," Chauncey said, his voice a low growl. "They know we're here now." He grabbed a few extra boxes of ammunition and shoved them into his saddlebags. He then turned to Donna, his eyes intense. He reached into a smaller bag and pulled out a compact 6-shot revolver. He pressed it into her hand. Her fingers were cold. I've never shot at a person," she stammered. Chauncey's gaze was unwavering. "Let's hope you don't have to start tonight. But if you do, you aim for the center of the chest and you don't stop pulling the trigger until it's empty." The weight of the gun in her hand was terrifying. It was a promise of violence, a tool of death. But it was also a chance to fight back. A sharp whistle echoed from the canyon outside. A signal. The rest of the pack was closing in. There was no escape back the way they came. They had to go deeper, deeper into the maze of caves and tunnels that Jedediah Kane called his den. "Stay close," Chauncey said, extinguishing the match and plunging them back into darkness. "And don't make a sound." He led the way, one hand on the damp cave wall, the other gripping his rifle. They moved through the suffocating blackness, their own breathing sounding loud as a drum in the silence. The cave system was a labyrinth. Tunnels branched off in every direction. A wrong turn could lead them straight into an ambush or a dead end. They could hear the voices of Kane's men echoing down the tunnels, distorted and ghostly. They were searching, sweeping the network methodically. Chauncey was relying on instinct, on the subtle changes in the airflow, the faint sounds that told him which way to go. He was using all his years of tracking and hunting, but this time he was the prey. He was teaching Donna as they went, communicating with hand signals, showing her how to step silently, how to use the shadows. She was a quick study. The fear was still in her eyes, but now it was forged with a grim determination. They rounded a tight corner and the tunnel opened up into a much larger cavern. The air here was different. It smelled of sweat, despair, and unwashed bodies. Chauncey held up a hand, signaling for them to stop. He peered around the edge of the rock. A single lantern cast a sickly yellow glow across the cavern. And in the center of the cavern was a crude holding pen made of thick wooden beams. Inside the pen were prisoners, half a dozen men, gaunt and filthy, their eyes hollow with defeat, and one of them looked up. His face was bruised and swollen, but there was no mistaking him. Donna let out a choked sob. It was her father. The reunion was a heartbreaking whisper in the dark. Donna pressed herself against the wooden bars of the pen, her fingers lacing with her father's. Tears streamed down her face as he told her the truth. He had been Kane's business partner, yes, but he had been coerced. He'd seen the darkness in Jedediah, the boundless cruelty, and he'd wanted out. He started keeping the ledger, a secret insurance policy, a way to expose Kane to the authorities if he could ever get it to them. Kane found out. The raid wasn't to kill him, it was to capture him, to torture him until he gave up the location of the ledger. When Kane's men couldn't find it, they realized he must have given it to Donna. So the hunt began. Her father looked at Chauncey, a flicker of hope in his tired eyes. "You have to get her out of here. Get the book to the Rangers in San Antonio. It's the only way to stop him." But there was no time for planning. No time for a daring escape. Torches flared to life at every entrance to the cavern. They had been walking in circles, right into the heart of the trap. Jedediah Kane stepped out of the shadows, a slow, self-satisfied smirk on his face. He was flanked by a dozen of his men, all of them armed to the teeth. "Well, isn't this touching?" Kane said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "A family reunion. I'm sorry to interrupt." He looked from the frightened prisoners to Donna, then finally let his gaze settle on Chauncey. "It's over, old friend," Kane said. "Nowhere left to run. Just give me the book." The standoff was thick with tension. Kane's men had their guns trained on Chauncey, on Donna, on her father. One wrong move and the cavern would erupt in a symphony of violence. Kane took a step forward, his eyes locked on Chauncey. "You know, I thought about you a lot over the years," he mused. "Lying in that dirt, bleeding out, watching you ride away. I promised myself if I ever saw you again, I'd return the favor." He gestured to the panther skin one of his men was now wearing as a cloak. "I even trained a pet for the occasion. A bit of poetry, don't you think? Having my beast finish what I couldn't." He held out his hand. "The ledger, Chauncey. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Chauncey looked at the ledger in Donna's hand. He looked at her terrified father. He looked at the dozen guns pointed at them. Then he looked at Jedediah. He slowly reached out and took the book from Donna. He took a step forward, holding it out. Kane's smile widened. He had won. And then Chauncey, with a sudden sharp movement, tossed the ledger. Not to Kane, but into the large fire pit burning in the center of the cavern. The little book landed in the flames with a soft hiss. For a heartbeat, everyone was frozen in disbelief. Then Jedediah Kane let out a roar of pure animalistic rage. "No!" The cavern exploded into chaos. "Kill them! Kill them all!" Kane shrieked, his face contorted into a mask of fury. Gunshots echoed off the stone walls, the sound deafening. Chauncey had already shoved Donna and her father toward a cluster of boulders, providing them with precious cover. He returned fire, his rifle barking in the enclosed space. He was a master of his craft. He didn't waste shots. Every bullet found its mark. One of Kane's men fell, then another. It was a desperate close-quarters battle. Bullets ricocheted off the rocks, sending chips of stone flying like shrapnel. The air was thick with gunpowder smoke and the smell of blood. Donna huddled behind the rocks, protecting her father, the revolver Chauncey had given her clutched in her hand. She was terrified, but the sight of Chauncey fighting, of him standing between them and certain death, ignited something in her. She wasn't helpless anymore. She peeked over the rock. One of Kane's men was trying to flank them, creeping along the cavern wall. She remembered Chauncey's words. "Aim for the center. She raised the revolver, her hands shaking. She squeezed the trigger. The gun bucked in her hand. The shot went wide, but it was enough. The outlaw flinched, turning toward her, surprised. That moment of distraction was all Chauncey needed. He spun and fired, and the man dropped. Chauncey gave her a quick, sharp nod, a gesture of approval, of respect, but they were still hopelessly outnumbered. Kane's men were closing in, their numbers overwhelming. Chauncey took aim at another outlaw, but a searing pain exploded in his left shoulder. He cried out, his arm going numb. The rifle clattered to the stone floor, just out of his reach. He was hit. He was exposed. Jedediah Kane saw his chance. A triumphant, cruel smile spread across his face. He began to walk forward, savoring the moment. He raised his own pistol, ready to deliver the final killing blow. "It's over, Chauncey," Kane gloated, his voice ringing with victory. "Just like I promised." He stood over the wounded Chauncey, the gun aimed at his head. But he had forgotten about Donna. She scrambled from behind the cover, not with her gun, but with something else. While the fight was raging, she had noticed a small, forgotten alcove, an old mining tunnel, and inside a crate of dusty, forgotten supplies. In her hands was a bundle of old, sweat-stained sticks of dynamite, and she was lighting the fuse. The fuse sputtered to life, a tiny, angry star in the smoky cavern. It was a short fuse. Jedediah Kane froze, his eyes wide with disbelief. His men stopped firing, their attention snapping to the woman with the burning bundle of death in her hands. "What do you think you're doing, girl?" Kane snarled, but the confidence in his voice was gone, replaced by a tremor of uncertainty. "Get back!" Donna screamed, her voice raw but steady. "All of you, get back, or I'll bring this whole mountain down on top of us!" Was it a bluff? Kane didn't know. He looked at her wild eyes, the grim set of her jaw. This wasn't the terrified girl he'd been hunting. This was someone new, someone dangerous. "Donna! No!" her father yelled from behind the rocks. The fuse burned shorter, spitting sparks onto the cavern floor. Kane's men started to back away, their loyalty to their leader warring with their instinct for self-preservation. "Don't be a fool!" Kane shouted, taking a hesitant step back. "You'll kill us all!" "That's the point!" she cried. But she wasn't looking at Kane. Her eyes darted for a moment to Chauncey, who was clutching his wounded shoulder. He saw what she was planning. He had noticed it earlier, a network of deep cracks in the cavern wall behind Kane's men, a structural weakness from the old mining operations. He gave her the slightest of nods. The fuse was almost gone, burning down to her fingertips. With a desperate cry, she didn't throw the dynamite at Kane. She hurled it with all her might at the weakened wall behind him. The bundle of dynamite arced through the air, a smoking comet of destruction. It landed in a crevice right at the base of the wall. The explosion was apocalyptic. It wasn't the roof that came down. It was the entire wall. It disintegrated into a tidal wave of rock and dirt, burying half of Kane's men in an instant. But that wasn't the worst of it. Behind the wall wasn't more rock. It was an underground river. A torrent of black churning water burst into the cavern, a furious, unstoppable force. It swept through the space, extinguishing the torches, swallowing the screams. In the chaos and confusion, Chauncey grabbed Donna and her father. "The water! It's our only chance!" He pulled them toward the raging current. The water was freezing, its power immense. It caught them, pulling them under, tossing them like rag dolls in the violent subterranean flood. They were swept away into the darkness, leaving the sound of Jedediah Kane's screams and the collapsing cavern behind them. They tumbled through the black water for what felt like an eternity, their lungs burning. Then, just as Chauncey felt his consciousness slipping away, they burst out into the moonlight. The river had carried them through the mountain. They washed up on a muddy bank, miles from the canyon, battered, bruised, half-drowned. But they were alive. And they were free. A week passed in a blur of healing and quiet reflection. They found their way to a small, isolated settlement of homesteaders, a place so far off the beaten path that the law was just a rumor. Chauncey's shoulder was bandaged, his arm in a sling. Donna's father, though still weak, was slowly regaining his strength. The ghosts of the cavern still haunted their sleep, but with every sunrise, the memories faded just a little more. The ledger was gone, destroyed in the fire. Kane's empire of crime would remain a secret, but they had their lives. For now, that was enough. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, Chauncey and Donna stood on a small hill overlooking the settlement. The borrowed peace felt fragile, temporary. "He'll come looking for us, won't he?" Donna said. It wasn't a question. Chauncey stared out at the endless prairie. "Jedediah doesn't know how to quit." He turned to her, his gaze serious. "When my arm is healed, I'm going after him. I have to finish this. I left him alive once. I won't make that mistake again." He expected her to argue, to be afraid. Instead, she just nodded. "Okay." He was taken aback. "Okay?" "You can't do it alone, Chauncey," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I know his operation. I know the routes my father told me about. I know the names that were in that book. I'm going with you." He started to protest, but she cut him off. "You saved my life," she said, her green eyes locking with his. "You showed me how to fight. You can't ask me to go back to being helpless now. We finish this, together." In that moment, he saw her not as a woman he needed to protect, but as an equal, a partner. The steel he had seen in her eyes that first night had been forged in fire and water into something unbreakable. Before he could respond, the sound of an approaching horse made them both turn. A lone rider was coming toward the settlement. He rode tall in the saddle, and the setting sun glinted off the silver star pinned to his vest. A Texas Ranger. The Ranger reined in his horse, his eyes scanning the two of them. His gaze lingered on Chauncey. "Took me a long time to find you," the Ranger said, his voice weary. "We heard a rumor you were still alive, Branrere." Chauncey tensed. "My business with the Rangers is over." "Not quite," the Ranger replied. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a rolled-up piece of parchment. A wanted poster. "A survivor from a collapsed mining operation washed up downriver a few days ago. Told a hell of a story. About you, and about the man who runs that whole territory." He unrolled the poster. The face was a crude sketch, but it was unmistakable. Jedediah Kane. "He's alive," the Ranger said, "and he's rebuilding, faster than before. The Rangers are putting together a company to go in and burn him out for good. We need men who know the territory, men who know how he thinks." He looked Chauncey square in the eye. "We need you." This was it, the chance to end it all, not as a vengeful survivor, but as an instrument of justice. Chauncey looked at Donna. She gave him a small, determined smile. Her decision was already made. He turned back to the Ranger. "You've got your man," Chauncey said, "but you're not just getting me." The final battle wasn't in a dark canyon or a hidden cave. It was under the bright, unforgiving Texas sun in a dusty, fortified town that Jedediah Kane had built as his personal kingdom. The fight was fierce. The Rangers, led by Chauncey and guided by Donna's knowledge, hit the town hard and fast. It was a chaotic swirl of gunfire, shouting, and desperation. Chauncey moved through the fight with a singular purpose. He wasn't just another soldier. He was a hunter, and he was tracking his final prey. He found Kane barricaded in the saloon, the same place where he'd made his crooked deals and planned his reign of terror. The final confrontation wasn't a quick draw in the street. It was a brutal, close-quarters brawl that smashed through tables and shattered mirrors. It was two ghosts from the past trying to exorcise one another. In the end, Chauncey stood over a beaten and bloodied Jedediah Kane. He had his pistol aimed at his former partner's heart. Kane looked up at him, a defiant, hateful sneer on his face. "Go on," Kane spat. "Finish it. Send me to hell." The old Chauncey, the man they called the Hunter Hercules, would have pulled the trigger without a second thought. But he wasn't that man anymore. He lowered the gun. "No," Chauncey said, his voice calm. "You don't deserve an easy way out. You're going to stand trial. You're going to answer for what you did." Justice, he had learned, was more powerful than revenge. With Kane captured, his gang collapsed. The town was liberated, and a semblance of peace began to return to that corner of the frontier. In the aftermath, the ranger captain offered Chauncey his badge back. A full reinstatement, a chance to be the man he once was. Chauncey looked over at Donna, who was talking with her father, now safe and free. He had spent years running from his past, alone under an endless sky. But now, for the first time, he had something to run to. He politely turned down the ranger's offer. A few weeks later, Chauncey and Donna stood on a hill overlooking a pristine piece of land, the same homestead her family had lost. They were going to rebuild, together. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and purple. It was the end of a long, bloody chapter, and the beginning of a new one. They had survived the darkness, and now they were ready to step into the light. Chauncey and Donna faced impossible odds, from a trained killer panther to a ghost from the past. They were hunted, trapped, and nearly killed, but they never gave up. They transformed from survivor and victim into a team built on trust and courage. But what do you think happens next? Can two people forged in such intense violence ever truly find peace, or will the ghosts of the frontier always be scratching at their door? Let us know your theories in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story of survival and justice, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more tales from the edge of the unknown.